Hey everyone, Happy New Year, and welcome back to It's Just AuDHD, the podcast where we explore the science behind ADHD and autism, share personal stories, and give you strategies to navigate life a little easier. Today we're diving into some fascinating and honestly kind of overwhelming trends about ADHD and 2024, and some predictions about ADHD in 2025. I was sick when we were scheduled to record this, so Tarah and I recorded separately this week. I'll kick things off with diagnosis trends, the latest from the DSM, and the ongoing medication shortage that's been making life so challenging for so many of us and our ability to function. Then I'll hand it over to Tarah to talk about her predictions for 2025, including how ADHD and autism are classified, misconceptions in the media, why we need a new branch of medicine, and the practical differences in coaching techniques for ADHD, and why standardized regulations and accountability are so important. Welcome to It's Just AuDHD. We're two curious ADHD coaches, and we're going deep on the how, the why, and the strategies to get through the difficult moments, and how to make the best of life with AuDHD. I'm John, and I've got an adult diagnosis of ADHD.
And I'm Tarah, and I have a late-in-life ADHD diagnosis and an even later autism diagnosis. We're going to be diving headfirst into the messy and often complicated research around ADHD and autism. And we're bringing you along for the journey as we break it all down and make sense of everything.
Because sometimes it's just life.
And sometimes it's just AuDHD.
So let's start with the big picture. ADHD diagnoses have been steadily increasing across all demographics, but 2024 has been significant. According to a study published in October by CHAD, that's the Children and Adults with Attention Deficit Hyperactivity Disorder Organization, about 15.5 million adults in the US, or 6% of the population, now have a current ADHD diagnosis. That's a big jump, showing how awareness is improving, especially for adults who have been missed in earlier years. To add to this, women aged 25 to 40 are leading that charge. Historically, ADHD has been underdiagnosed in women because their symptoms often show up differently. But in 2024, we're seeing a surge in diagnoses for this group. The Financial Times linked this trend to greater awareness of ADHD in women, thanks to social media platforms like TikTok, where people are sharing their stories and symptoms. So shout out to everyone breaking the stigmas and creating community online. It's clearly working, so let's keep that up. Now, when it comes to kids, the numbers are also climbing. A report from opb.org earlier this year showed that about 1 in 9 children between the ages of 3 and 17 have been diagnosed with ADHD, and that's up compared to 2016. All right, now, to switch gears for a second and talk about the DSM, it's basically the reference manual for mental health professionals for making diagnoses. It got a big update in 2022, and we're still seeing the effects of that one today. But the most notable changes for ADHD in 2024, they didn't touch the diagnostic criteria, which means ADHD still excludes emotional dysregulation. For autism spectrum disorder, though, in 2022, they made some tweaks to the language. They also added some more flexibility in how co-occurring issues like self-injury can be recognized, even if they don't meet the threshold for a separate disorder. But nothing substantial in 2024. And that's just too bad. And it's just sad that as our understanding of these conditions continues to increase and evolve, after so many years, there still isn't a substantial update to DSM. So let's talk about ADHD medication for a minute. This one is huge for me. It's impacted me a lot over this past year, and I'm sure many of you as well. It started back in October of 2022, and here we are in 2024, still struggling. I don't love everything Psychology Today puts out, but they're calling it the worst it's been, and I've got to agree with that. With supply chain issues, increased demand, and even the DEA production quotas all playing a part. Now, the DEA quotas are a big deal here. They're supposed to prevent the misuse of stimulant medications, which, to be honest, I don't know what misuse even looks like for this kind of medication, particularly for a population that relies on it and sometimes forgets to take it. But they haven't been updated to match the rising demand. Meanwhile, manufacturers are facing supply chain problems, and the generic drug market isn't incentivized to scale production. This kind of shortage has left a lot of people rationing doses or switching to less effective treatments. For many of us, it's been a constant cycle of calling pharmacies, waiting on back orders, and just trying to function without the medication we rely on. That summarizes a lot of what I've been through, and it sucks. So I think looking at all of this, the silver lining, or at least the good thing about what's happening with ADHD, the trend, and especially seeing this happen throughout 2024, is that awareness is up. More people are getting diagnosed, and we're learning to recognize ADHD in different groups. So learning to destigmatize it and talk about it is so valuable. Reducing stigma is helping doctors get better at recognizing the diverse ways that ADHD shows up in people that might have been missed otherwise. But on the other hand, these rising numbers also highlight the gaps in access to resources, and we're still fighting systemic issues like medication shortages and outdated policies that make it harder for people to get the help that they need. So if this is your reality, whether it's struggling to get your meds or navigating new diagnosis, know that you're not alone. Keep advocating for yourself and your needs, because progress is happening, even if it feels slow. I'm going to take a guess that you or someone you know is navigating ADHD if you're listening to this podcast. So just know that you're not alone. These numbers tell a story of growth and awareness. While it's not always easy, it's a reminder that the work we're doing, educating, advocating, connecting, makes a real difference. Okay, so now I'll hand it off to Tarah to talk about her predictions for AuDHD in 2025. All right, take it away, Tarah.
Thank you so much, John, for sharing some of those best and worst moments from 2024. Why am I not surprised that I get to be disappointed in the DSM yet another year? Let's take a look at some of my predictions for 2025 and beyond. I know that these things are probably not going to happen in 2025, but I can dream, right? So we'll call these my predictions for the hopefully near, but probably distant future, if I'm being honest with myself. Okay, so prediction number 1 is that ADHD and autism will be broken into subtypes and classified based on gene clusters that you personally have inherited. So I guess wrapped up in this, there are a couple things. I think that diagnosis will change down the line. I think that it's going to be someday more genetics based when we have more of the technology and the knowledge to do so. And I also think that they will no longer be seen as homogeneous conditions. And I think that AuDHD, where you have the intersection of both, will be its own condition or several conditions potentially. So let me explain why I think that this is going to be the case someday. When we have general discourse about ADHD and autism, a lot of the stuff you read in the news is that we don't know what causes it. It's very mysterious. And I think that part of this comes from the difference in the way that the scientific community speaks and the way in which the average person speaks. So take, for example, the term theory. A theory in the scientific community is actually something that has had a significant amount of evidence. It's a lot stronger than a hypothesis. There's been repeated studies. Gravity, for example, is a theory. There's an overwhelming amount of evidence that gravity is real. Nobody, or at least most of the planet, is not questioning the existence of gravity. But scientific terminology means that gravity is still a theory. The scientific community has a burden to prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that something is fact, particularly with something as sensitive as medical conditions. We can't just look at one study and say, yep, we've nailed it, this is it. We have to be able to reproduce those studies over and over and over to gain confidence that we think that this is what's really going on, because lives are at stake if we get it wrong. And every single study on the planet is subject to confounding variables, biases, flaws with the setup. And that is why reproducibility is so important. And so when researchers are looking at ADHD and autism, they can say, this is what we think is happening. We are trying to add to the growing body of evidence. That doesn't mean that we have absolutely no idea. But I think sometimes when journalists read that terminology, they take it to mean that we have absolutely no idea what's going on. And so you will see these articles published. Take, for example, the assumption that red dyes could cause ADHD. There may well be studies out there that show that kids that consumed red dyes had more severe symptoms of ADHD. Did the red dye cause the ADHD? Or could it perhaps be that one of the ingredients in red dyes can exacerbate the condition? Perhaps it interferes with dopamine production. Perhaps it's not the red dye itself, but an indicator that the kid is not having their nutritional needs met, which again would exacerbate symptoms. How do we know that these kids weren't already carriers of genes that encode ADHD? Correlation does not equal causation, but sometimes that gets lost in translation when you see reporting in the media. And so that's why you see all these articles where it's, we don't know what causes ADHD. Could it be this? Could it be that? Same thing with autism. Could it be this? Could it be that? Well, no. And that's also not really what the original study was trying to show. But it's like a rumor or a game of telephone. The more it gets passed along, the more those relevant details get lost. What I'm trying to get at here is that we do know that ADHD and autism are incredibly heritable. In the scientific community, it's not even a question of whether it's genetic. We're at the point where we're like, okay, but which genes? Like, it's not even a question of if, it's which ones. So we're well beyond that point of if. What's fascinating is that both ADHD and autism are polygenic conditions. So what this means is there is not one particular ADHD gene. There's not one particular autism gene. It's actually many, many, many genes, and your particular combination of genes is going to influence the presentation of your traits or symptoms, or however you choose to describe it. And so that is why we have so much variance in the presentations of ADHD and autism. You hear the saying, if you've met one person with ADHD, you've met one person with ADHD, because we are all so different from each other. And part of that is because we each have our own combination of different genes. So this brings up another common media misconception. When you hear the term autism spectrum, people tend to think that this means that everyone on the planet falls somewhere on the spectrum of autism. And that's not actually what it's referring to. What it means is that of the folks who are autistic, the traits present on a spectrum. And so for one person, rigidity might be one of their predominant challenges, but maybe they don't have as much challenge in like a social arena. Like maybe they are better with reading other people's emotions, for example. The way that I like to think of it is neurodivergent people have a very spiky profile. Some of us have a lot of strengths, and we also have more impairments. And when I say strengths, I also don't mean this in the way that, like, it's a superpower that you're born with. I mean, we work hard for our talents. A lot of us have special interests with very deep areas of knowledge. If you can't tell, ADHD and autism are one of my special interests. But I didn't just like snap my fingers and acquire this knowledge. I do so much reading. Like, it's actually problematic. I can't look at a research paper, like on the National Institute of Health. I cannot pull up a paper before bed because sometimes if I see a really interesting one, I will get too excited and I can't go to bed. Like I've read 70-page papers before at like 4 a.m. because I was just too excited to sleep because I thought it was interesting. So it's a little bit of a problem. It's not that we're born with superpowers. We invest time and effort to learn things we care about and acquire skill sets that we care about. So we tend to have kind of these depths of knowledge potentially or other skills that we are proficient in, but then also extreme challenges, you know, like I, for example, am able to synthesize papers pretty easily at this point, but like I get freaked out doing laundry. I can't explain it to you. I don't know why it's such a challenge for me. It just is. And so I will put it off for months and it's a problem. I don't know why I have such a deficit in that area, but I do. Another example is one time when I was working in another state for 3 months. They gave us temporary housing for like an internship, and I could not deal with doing the dishes. I struggle with the texture of dirty food in water, like wet food. I don't know why it is so repulsive to me, which, by the way, if you have this same thing, I've seen a hot tip online, just wear gloves. I don't know why that didn't occur to me, but it didn't. And so I couldn't do dishes, but they'd have housekeeping come in once a week because we were in these teeny tiny little, basically extended stay, Holiday Inn type of things. So they'd have housekeeping come in once a week to grab your trash. And I was so embarrassed by the dirty dishes everywhere. It probably was unsanitary, honestly, but I would stash it away in my closet so that they couldn't see that I had these filthy dishes sitting around, but I couldn't bring myself to clean them. That's a deficit. That is a low point on my spiky profile. So this is what it is meant when we refer to the autism spectrum, is that there is a spectrum of presentations. Now, your particular profile is dependent on the flavor of genes that you inherited, which is what is so fascinating. So they're starting to do research that is showing preliminary results. There are particular genes that make you more predisposed to, in particular, oppositional defiance disorder with ADHD. There are particular genes that correspond to rigid behaviors with autism. And there's many such examples of these studies, but it's incredible that we're not just looking at the genes for the conditions themselves, but actually starting to look at the genes for the traits. And so this is what I mean. I think at some point in the future, we're going to be able to pair your lived experience with your particular genes and put those together and be able to say, you have this particular flavor of neurodivergence, and come up with more precise labels for it that would also help with finding community, honestly, finding similar people, finding treatments for, the genes encode proteins, right? That's their whole goal in life. That is the whole purpose of genes, is to encode proteins. Those proteins aren't single purposed. So when you have a gene mutation and the proteins that it's creating are different in some way, that can have other outcomes beyond just ADHD or autism. And we're going to talk about this in my third prediction more. But it can also lead to things like autoimmune disorders. And so being able to use your specific genetic presentation to assist with those downstream effects like autoimmune disorders or even things like epilepsy or other comorbid conditions is, I think, where this is going to go directionally. That segues into another one of my predictions for beyond 2025, we'll call it. I think that at some point we will have our own branch of medicine. And let me explain why I think that's the case. So today, if you were to go to school and you're like, I want to get a degree where I can work with people who have ADHD and autism, it's a little funky, the path that you would have to take. So you wouldn't necessarily get a psychiatry degree. There's actually an article from Attitude magazine that mentions that 93% of psychiatrists don't receive formal training on ADHD, which is concerning to say the least, because they are the ones who are diagnosing us and prescribing us with medications. So, not great. You wouldn't go into psychology. These things are not covered under the branches of traditional psychology. You would need to get a neuropsychology degree. That's the more typical degree path. But what neuropsychology covers is basically brain-based differences. So, okay, that tracks. These are brain-based differences. But it also includes things like brain tumors, things like Parkinson's, Alzheimer's, car accidents, drug and alcohol abuse. And then ADHD and autism are kind of the other category covered by neuropsych. And I would argue some of those don't fit as well, because ADHD, autism, you're born with those. That's your entire life. They're genetic. They have impacts on mental and physical health. Whereas a car crash it doesn't feel the same. It doesn't feel like those should necessarily be the same doctors, right? I don't know. Maybe that's just me. It just doesn't feel like a good fit necessarily. The problem, I think, with this level of siloing is that we end up with these deeply specialized individuals, and medicine tends to be focused on depth versus breadth. I don't know if I'm explaining this well, but here's what I mean. So if you go to a general practitioner, they usually won't be the ones who are saying you have ADHD or autism. You'd go to a specialist for that, and they would do an evaluation. Okay, so what happens if you come in and you have an autoimmune disorder? Well, you'd go to an entirely different doctor. What happens if you come in and you have an allergy? You'd go to an allergist. Well, a rheumatologist would be the term. They generally don't have any sort of training in ADHD or autism. But what studies are showing is that it is significantly more common to have things like autoimmune disorders, to have things like allergies, all that sort of clustering of symptoms with ADHD and autism. And in fact, to my point earlier about genetic research, we're finding the genetic links that encode those differences and have those common paths. One of those theories is actually called the RCCX theory. And when I say theory now, I'm using it in a layman's way. This, from a scientific perspective, is a hypothesis because there's very limited research. But at any rate, Sharon Megla, I hope I'm saying that right, I apologize, is a psychiatrist who developed this hypothesis that shows the potential genes that link ADHD and autism to lupus, rheumatoid arthritis, anxiety, depression, chronic fatigue, Lyme disease, fibromyalgia, hypermobility, and Ehlers-Danlos. So if you have any of those things on the list, worth having a chat with your doctor if you are also diagnosed with ADHD and or autism, because they are significantly more common for us than for other individuals. In fact, I call it the Holy Grail. This is a very common clustering of 5 things. It's ADHD, autism, POTS, which is postural orthostatic tachycardia syndrome, mast cell activation syndrome, and hypermobility. Don't worry, we have a number of episodes planned for this in the new year that we're going to deep dive into that explain the connections across all of these different things, but the research shows that it's more common. Unfortunately, RCCX theory or hypothesis is hard to prove. And it's because it's reliant on this concept of having copy number variants of particular genes. So what does that mean? Well, we talked about it a little bit in our first episode. The way that they, in a lab, look at your genetics, your genes don't come through all completely intact in one nice long strand, and it's not some person sitting and reading all the bases. They're chopped up when you scrape your cheek and you swab it and you send it into 23andMe or whatever. They're chopped up into little pieces. And so it's their job to look at those little pieces and say, oh, this really looks like this chunk from this chromosome. That's where it goes. And so they sit and assemble it, right? Well, and it's all not just one cell that you're submitting. It's thousands, millions of cells with little chunks. And so they have to sit and assemble. And so the problem is a copy number variant means that you have a section of your DNA that repeats itself multiple times. And so think of this like a puzzle. If you had the same puzzle and like 5 of the exact same puzzle, and you took a handful of random pieces out of each of those puzzles, you mixed them all together and you told someone to go assemble it, they could probably assemble one full puzzle based on all the pieces you sent in. Now, if one of those boxes had the same piece 5 times, it would be really hard to know that, right? And so that's why copy number variants are very hard to identify in a traditional commercial laboratory setting. I think that there's some way they can like test it in a lab with very expensive machinery. I'm not sure. But traditional labs like your 23andMe's or all the newer ones can't really detect it. So that makes RCCX hard to research. But at any rate, we have these genetic links that are starting to emerge that show that we are significantly more predisposed to these types of, I'll call them autoimmune flavored conditions from that long list that I read off. And the problem is that doctors don't have specialization. Well, so why does it matter that they're linked? Because our bodies interact with things differently. Like there's even research that autistic individuals process CBD oil differently than neurotypicals. Like when you're predisposed to these conditions, you're not going to react the same way to procedures, to medications, to different treatments. When your doctor doesn't know that, and they're trying to help you with these conditions that are already somewhat rare with limited research, things like Ehlers-Danlos is considered somewhat rare. I think some of them are undercounted, though, if I'm being honest, and I think a lot of researchers would agree with me. Then you're at a significant disadvantage to being able to help yourself and being able to find workable solutions. And so this is the problem, is the siloing of medicine and doctors not having background knowledge in not only ADHD and autism and the way they present, but also the physical manifestations of the body. There are things like PMDD, like horrible periods for women, significantly more common with ADHD. But when a teenage girl comes into her general practitioner and says, I have horrible periods, do they screen them for ADHD? No, not today. And that's why I think that at some point there will be an entirely separate branch of medicine, not neuropsych, but just an entirely separate branch of medicine that looks at neurodivergent people holistically and evaluates the whole body instead of just looking at our behaviors and looking at just the brain-based differences, that actually looks at our physiological differences as well. Because let's be honest, these are the things that cause us pain and suffering. For me, people ask, would you give up your ADHD, your autism? I wouldn't, because I don't know who I would be. That has shaped my personality in such a profound way that if you were to take those things away, I would be a different person. I like myself. I wouldn't want to be someone else. But would I take away painful periods? Would I take away autoimmune stuff? Like, would I poof away my POTS and mast cell? Absolutely, like without hesitation. Those are the things that cause suffering, and those are the things that we should be working towards treating. And so that is why it would be so revolutionary to have some sort of branch of medicine that looks at the whole body, top to bottom, and find solutions for us. Okay, and switching gears slightly, my third prediction for 2025 and or probably the future and not 2025 is I think that ADHD coaching will become a regulated field. So a lot of folks out there might be asking, what is an ADHD coach? And John and I are both ADHD coaches, and it's a little hard to understand. It's not therapy. We're not, like we say in our intro, we are not doctors. It's not a medical field. There are meaningful differences. So ADHD coaching is designed to help you come up with practical solutions based on your very real, everyday challenges. So there's a saying, pills don't give skills, and that is true. Once you take ADHD meds, for example, that doesn't just automatically poof away all your problems. It helps. It certainly gives you the physiological ability to do tasks more easily because you're upping the dopamine, you're increasing the norepinephrine in the brain, which makes it a lot easier to initiate and complete tasks and emotionally regulate and all of those things that come with having a deficiency in the first place. But that doesn't mean that you automatically acquire the skills to be able to act on it. And so that's where an ADHD coach comes into play. And we encompass a very different part of your life than like your therapist, because therapy is really focusing on addressing like underlying mental health concerns, healing from traumas, looking at your past, like doing that deep healing. Coaching is very goal-oriented, very tactical. It's helping you create skill sets around specific issues. So like, for example, earlier in the podcast, I talked about how hard it is for me to wash dishes, how that's such a challenge, touching like dirty, wet food. I could talk about that with my therapist potentially, but that isn't necessarily something I would talk about. Whereas with a coach, we would come up with practical strategies. And that's where we might land on something like use rubber gloves, put on gloves when you need to wash dishes. So it's very strategic and generally short term as well. You're not going to a coach for long term. Usually you purchase packages for like 3 months of coaching. So you might do 12 sessions. So another one of the key differences between therapy and coaching is that therapy is a highly regulated field. There is licensure, and in fact, there's legal culpability. Like, you cannot harm your patients. You can get your license taken away. You can have bad outcomes if you are abusive as a therapist, and there's a regulatory board that enforces that. But again, therapy is regulated. Unfortunately, it's at the state level in the United States, which we'll talk about that in a minute, why that's problematic. But it is regulated by a government and not by a self-governing organization. You have to have gone through the schooling, and it's quite a lot of schooling. They have to get at a minimum a master's in a related field. They have to go through a number of years of observation, and that's how you get, and a lot of hours of practice. That's how you get licensure as a therapist. Anyone can call themselves a coach, whether or not they have gotten a certification from any of the coaching institutions. And that is where you can get into trouble. And we see this a lot, less so with the field of ADHD coaching, but more so in the field of life coaching. A lot of people will just go out there and say, I'm a coach, and do some abusive things. Honestly, they'll take advantage of people, take their money without really helping them, or worse. And there's no one to stop them because anyone can call themselves a coach. Now, I think that some therapeutic regulation has gone a little too far. So like I said, it's regulated at the state level. So what that means is that if you get licensed as a therapist in like the state of Texas and then you move to California, you have to get relicensed. And that's a meaningful amount of work. That's also why a lot of folks might have run into the issue if they transitioned into telehealth therapy. If you go on vacation or something like that, your therapist isn't allowed technically to treat you. I think they made some exceptions during COVID because we all needed therapy and we couldn't come in person, and a lot of people did go remote, but those exceptions are not in place anymore. So today your therapist is not supposed to see you if you are out of state unless it's like a medical emergency or something like that. Part of that is because if you do become a threat to yourself, they need to be able to know where resources are located in your area. So there's, there's some good reasoning behind that, but It also makes it challenging for therapists to have mobility, to move states, let alone countries. Like, my God, if you wanted to go work in the UK and you had gotten licensure in the United States, well, say hello to a lot more schooling and training, even if you've been in the field for 20 years. Now, on the coaching side, we're underregulated for sure. Because again, anyone can call themselves a coach. My prediction as well is I don't think in the future that ADHD coaching will be considered coaching at all. So there are different flavors of coaching. There's like life coaching, there's executive coaching, which is more focused on in the workplace. So a lot of like CEOs get executive coaching, and it's effectively someone to go talk to about your work decisions. And then there's ADHD coaching. ADHD coaching doesn't fit with the ones that I stated before, in my opinion. And unfortunately, what I've sometimes observed is that ADHD coaching can feel like an add-on. It can feel like it's life coaching with a twist, whereas ADHD coaching needs to be radically different. So to give some specific examples, when you are doing life coaching or executive coaching, in general, you let the client set the topic of the session. So you'd say, okay, what do you want to talk about today? And the client would bring something to you. Well, with ADHD, we have memory impairments. And so we can't always necessarily know what we need to talk about. Like, we can say, I'm struggling. And they go, okay, on what? What do you want to talk about? And you go, I don't know. I'm just struggling. You can go, work is hard. And so it's very, it's different. Approach that I like is if the client comes and at the start of their 12-week package or whatever, this is what my coaches have done with me, because I've received coaching before I became a coach. They'd have us write out goals, and we had like a list of 10 goals, and my coach helped me come up with them together, and we would revisit them on every session. We'd say, okay, we checked off number 2 last time. Do you still feel like those solutions are working for you? If not, let's revisit it. If so, which of these other ones feel most relevant to you this week? And I could go, ooh, number 7, actually, that came up for me at work this week. And then we would talk about number 7. So kind of preceding the session with a list of topics that the client might want to address is very helpful, instead of just letting them like open-ended set the topic of the session, which is one of the tenets of life coaching. Another tenet that I think is a bit problematic from life coaching that doesn't work for ADHD clients is this idea that the answer is always within the client. And there's a good reason why they do it for life coaching. So the idea is you don't want a client to become reliant on you to solve all their problems. You don't want them to be coming to you for advice. You give it, and then you create this sort of dependency, because coaching is meant to be brief. And the principle behind coaching is that the client is always whole and complete. They don't have any deficits, and that the answer is always within them, and you're just helping them to find it and explore. Great principles. In practice, challenging for ADHD, because no matter how whole you are and self-actualized you are as an ADHDer, you may have never heard of Pomodoro technique. And that could change your life. And no matter how many questions I ask you, you may not reinvent the wheel and churn out Pomodoro technique, for example. I'm using this as just a very specific example. And so I think sometimes with ADHD clients, it's a little bit more necessary to be the teacher and to be the advice giver compared to like a life coach. Another example is asking retroactive questions. So with life coaching, you are not supposed to ask questions that really dig into their past, because you risk the potential of veering into a therapy type discussion. But this is a little different with ADHDers because we have memory deficits. And so a very successful technique that I have found with clients is you can ask them, okay, where have you had similar success before? And as a coach, you're supposed to refer them out to a therapist, which is why it's so important to get coaches who do follow some sort of ethics board or have some sort of certification in general, or something, because if they don't know to refer you out, then you could have just someone who's completely unqualified doing therapy things. And I would love to see it globally regulated such that coaches can help anyone from anywhere in the world, because needs don't change. Same thing with psychology. Like, the psychology of someone in the UK is not wildly different from someone in California. It would be amazing if there was a set of core tenets that practitioners should follow, but I would love to see more oversight and more regulation and accountability in the coaching field, and have executive functioning coaching be considered like a completely separate entity, and perhaps even taught separately from those other forms of coaching. Now, I'll plug the place that I got trained at. ADHD Works is run by Leanne Maskell. That was an amazing place to learn because she herself has ADHD and autism, and so she understands. She's written several books. She's even lobbied for the UK government to change their approach, and so she's very knowledgeable in the field. And so I felt like she understood all of the unique challenges that we face when I was receiving that type of coaching. Well, that wraps up my predictions for optimistically 2025, but realistically, someday, we hope. But let us know in the comments section, what are your predictions for the coming year or years? You guys can predict a little bit further out, just like I did. But let us know. We'd love to hear your thoughts. We'd love to hear if you think that this was spot on or if we got something wrong too. Hope you have a fantastic new year, and we will look forward to seeing you again in 2025 for a whole host of exciting new episodes.